All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another webinar in our educational series. Today, we will focus on demystifying measurements in a post-iOS and cookie world. Now, there are a lot of acronyms being thrown around out there and a lot of different types of measurement solutions claiming to be the solution that you need. But the truth is, there's no solution that's perfect, so you need to understand the pros and cons of each and make an informed decision and do what's right for your business. So today, I'm going to lead a discussion with James Gerber, who is head of product at Measured. James started his career on the agency side, like many of us, but has spent the last 9 years on the marketing analytics side of the house. So he has a keen understanding of how the different types of solutions have evolved over time, especially in the last couple of years. So with that, please welcome James.
Thanks a lot, Sean. Very happy to be here. As Sean mentioned, I have quite a bit of experience in this space, and actually very specifically about incrementality testing. So from the agency side to building incrementality testing solutions on the vendor side to now running measurement against all the available solutions at Measured. So I've really seen it all over, my career, and I'm really happy to talk to everybody about it. There's a lot of movement happening right now in the space. It's a really interesting time to be in marketing analytics. I hope you all are excited. And we're happy to talk to you about the new state of affairs.
Yeah, I never thought measurement would be an exciting topic, but here we are.
Yeah.
All right, so James, flip ahead one. And so today, we're going to try and give everyone a better understanding of the types of measurements solutions at their disposal across the advertising landscape, what the pros and cons of each methodology are. I know that many brands and retailers or agencies are struggling with all the restrictions and changes that have been imposed on us by Apple and Google and all the other browsers, and obviously privacy laws. So we'll visit that. And then lastly, how marketing measurement has evolved. And like I said, James has a lot of experience here, but we'll probably focus on the last couple of years since these changes have really impacted what we do in our industry. So this is meant to be a lively discussion. So please pop up any questions you have in the Q&A section, and I'll try and get to them as we move through our discussion. Next slide.
Okay.
All right,
great.
So James, the changes that tracking restrictions created are well documented, but can you take us a little deeper and comment on how they've created challenges for the marketing measurement?
Yeah, this has been a long slide down the user tracking journey. It probably peaked 10 years ago in terms of how much of the media you could track across different vendors. And it's just gotten worse and worse every year. It started, 7 years ago when Google removed double-click IDs from data transfers, so then third parties struggled to measure double-click impressions across vendors. And it's gotten worse, specifically in the last 12 months, as Apple rolled out iOS 14. You failed to be able to track users across devices and across apps within the iOS device. And then Facebook made a bunch of changes to how they report. And now all the vendors are basically trying to figure out how can they at least report things internally, let alone how those numbers gross up and match up to what your finance team might have. And so it's made it really, really, really difficult for marketers to use the traditional form of pixel tracking to kind of follow users around the different touch points in their portfolio and really understand the path to conversion and how much each touch point is incremental to that conversion.
Right. So James, one question from the audience, and I don't know what your experience is in the EU, but someone's asking what your feelings on the recent Austrian and EU decision to ban or block Google Analytics.
Yeah, I don't know much about that, to be honest. I haven't actually seen that in the news. Google Analytics technically is a first-party tag. I mean, we're getting deep in the weeds here, but it's technically a first-party tag on websites. And so I'm not sure what they're blocking or why they're blocking it, but that would be another, case of user tracking becoming more and more difficult, right? And honestly, whether or not Google Analytics is blocked, when you look in Google Analytics and you look at your ratio of new to repeat users, those are really unreliable these days because Google can't track people over time. And so even core metrics like how many new people come in every day are pretty unreliable in Google Analytics nowadays. And so is Google Analytics going away in the US anytime soon? Probably not. But is it the source of truth anymore for marketers? No, not usually.
So let me ask you, James, with all the sort of first party versus third party conversations and third party data being blocked, obviously the walled gardens were in a sort of better position than non-walled gardens historically. Do you think that's a continued trend, and do you see more publishers sort of creating a walled garden effect with their own first party data?
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's interesting about the concept of these walled gardens because, 5-7 years ago, you used to be able to track a lot around the web, and Facebook was unique in building this walled garden that prevented you from tracking it. Facebook's not so unique anymore. You're going to struggle to track ads across all vendors, no matter whether it's Facebook with a walled garden or Criteo without a walled garden. And so it's really now about browsers and devices. So it's actually gone up several levels. It's no longer about the actual platform building its walled garden. Those walled gardens have expanded now. They're at like the device level and the browser level. And so what that means is you can't rely on any vendor, whether it's a walled garden like Facebook or a company like Criteo or any other DSP that isn't a walled garden. It doesn't really matter. You can't rely on those vendors anymore to really measure the value of the media because they don't track everything anymore. Even Facebook is missing a lot of user data these days.
Makes sense. Okay, thanks for that.
Okay, we'll get into the good stuff. It's not all bad news. There are some good things happening. But very high level, everybody, measuring the true contribution of media is hard, and it's getting harder and harder every year. Obviously, there's a rapidly evolving measurement landscape and privacy landscape to navigate. Vendor reporting was broken before. Now it's really, really, really broken, and it's broken in inconsistent ways, and we'll go through that. And actually developing your own in-house measurement solutions is quite resource intensive and has a relatively high cost to it. It's important, but it's not something you can do overnight. And so we're going to talk about some solutions and some options that you all can explore in lieu of building your own in-house resource.
Okay.
Okay. So first, we're going to talk about. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry,
just before we get into the different methodologies, I wanted to pop up a poll question here. Hopefully, everybody can see it, but I think this will help us understand what the audience experience is with the different types of measurement that we're going to discuss today. So the question is, what type of measurement are you using now, or have you used in the past? And there's a few choices there: mixed media modeling, multi-touch attribution, incrementality, last click, or something else. So let me launch that, and then I'll let everyone just take a couple of seconds to answer, and then we'll move on in the deck, if you don't mind. I would think everyone, I guess last click would be the old way of thinking.
Yeah, other could mean, quick path analysis. You could be using data-driven attribution, which is Google's version of MTA within Google Analytics, right? So maybe you call that other, but there's a couple things that would fall into other. Most of it's going to be, I think, last click when you think of the non-measurement approaches.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for filling this out. Appreciate it. All right, James, I'll let you dive in a little bit here.
Okay, great. All right, guys, so we're going to talk the three different methodologies that were kind of called out in that slide. We're not going to get into last touch. Everyone knows it's not accurate, but we're going to talk about the pros and cons of each of the other three: MTA, media mix modeling, and incrementality testing. So MTA, which of course everyone knows stands for multi-touch attribution, has been around for 10 plus years now, maybe up to 15 years now, and it's still useful in some ways. It's less useful than it used to be because of the user tracking issues, right? And so you can't actually track most of the ads around the internet anymore, and you can't build those paths to conversion as completely as you used to be able to. That said, MTA is still useful for granular insights on the path to conversion. Now, it's not capturing the whole population, but even if it's sampling 20%, you can still look at that 20% sample and look at those paths to conversions and generate some insights. These channels overlap, there's this halo effect, these channels tend to come first and these channels come last. You can still do that analysis with MTA. Other pros, and I mentioned the halo effect analysis, but it's really great for in-flight short-term campaign optimizations. Why is it good for that? Well, the data is generally updated and generated within, a day or two of the event happening. And so it's very, very quick, usually, to produce results after you get it up and running. So it can be really reactive to changes in your media buy, changes in your on-site conversion rates, et cetera, et cetera. Generally, it's going to predict credit for all trackable touch points and all trackable marketing activities. The cons are well known. You don't track everything anymore. It's going to rely on pixel data for all of its modeling. And I mean, pixels on your conversion pages. Those are getting less and less accurate as well. We typically find pretty large discrepancies between conversion pixel data and the actual order volume and sales data that finance uses. Another major issue with it, in fact, as an analyst, I find this to be the biggest issue. Multi-site attribution generally assumes that correlation equals causation. What do I mean when I say that? All conversions that are observed with either observed or synthetic touch points in the path are incrementally attributed to media. What do I mean by synthetic? A lot of MTA vendors are now inserting what they believe to be impressions before the conversion, even if they're not tracking them. And so that's what they call synthetic touch points that they insert into the path to conversion. It basically assumes if there's any touch point that it is incrementally attributed to the media, right? When you run an in-market test for incrementality, you will discover that there's a big portion of your sales that would have occurred even without the media. And so that correlation equals causation is a major issue with MTA. It also needs regular calibration, and because of this conflation of correlation and causation, you often end up over-attributing sales to media.
Hey, James, when you speak about the synthetic assumptions that the MTA vendors are making, do you think that that's entirely clear to the buyers of those solutions that maybe had used that same solution for the last couple of years when it was more real, right? And now it's sort of a little bit of projecting.
I'm sure they don't run from it, but they may not emphasize it, certainly. And if you were to ask them what % of the impressions are synthetic versus observed, you might find an answer that you don't really like. And I don't know how often they're getting that question. That ratio is changing every month. It's getting more and more weighted towards synthetic and less weighted towards observed because tracking is getting harder and harder. So they had to do this because if they weren't inserting these synthetic touch points, they'd have no idea how to gross up the totals to reflect what they actually think is driven by the media. Unfortunately, that means it's modeling on top of modeling on top of modeling now, and so it's a lot of predicted values. Even the inputs are now predicted values.
Let me ask you this. So I remember, this is going back several years when I worked at Criteo. A lot of times, particularly around 2014, 15, I would get a lot of my prospects saying, interested, but we're in the process of implementing an MTA strategy. It's supposed to take a few months to set up, but we don't want to do anything new until we get that set up and get a read on what's working and what's not working. And then, obviously I keep checking in, and then, a year later, maybe 8 months later, I would, get them on a phone or in a meeting, and they'd say, it would just look depleted and exasperated and say, it wasn't what we thought it was. We thought it was going to take 3 or 4 months to implement. It took 8 or 9. We're not getting the data that we thought we were going to get. So, and I never understood why that was, because to me, it just seemed like you put up a JavaScript, you start tracking, you get your data, you make your analysis. So why did it take so long for them to get set up? And what does that process look like? Is it just tagging, or is there more to it than that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So back in the day, and I'm speaking of, aging myself, 2008, 2012, DoubleClick and Atlas were the major ad servers that clients and marketers were using. And generally, vast majority of ads were both served and tracked within those ad servers. And so if you as a marketer wanted to add a third-party tag to all your impressions, you had one place to go do it. You could probably do it very, very quickly. I mean, in a matter of minutes. Nowadays, most vendors don't allow third-party tracking. I mean, Criteo does, right? The DSPs do, but most of these platforms don't allow third-party impression tracking. And so it requires a lot of modeling to estimate when those impressions hit and what their impact is. And so it requires, if you're spinning up an MTA model now and you look at your portfolio, how much of your portfolio can you apply an impression tracker to? Right, that's the question. It's probably much less than half of the portfolio now for most marketers, right? You can't do it in AdWords, you can't do it on Facebook. You can basically only do it in DSPs now. And so generally that makes it much harder to set up tracking across the portfolio, right? You would have to go to each vendor, explore what they can and can't do. And then the multi-touch attribution company you're working with is going to have to figure out, for vendors like Facebook, what do? How do they insert these synthetic impression touch points to make the model work? Because obviously Facebook's a big channel, right? So these things take time now. In fact, it's similar to media mix modeling. It's a lot of modeling. It's a lot of tuning of the dials to get to a reasonable result.
Yep. Okay. I think I understand it better. All right, we can move on. Thanks for that.
Also,
James.
maybe not the best MTA vendor. I'm not sure.
Well, I was just curious. Like, obviously, it's different. It's different now, right? The challenges are different now. And I don't know if the implementation is different now. But I just know back then it took what seemed odd a long time to implement.
Yeah,
and I never understood why.
Yeah, it's because it's one of the things that we'll get into in market testing. When you're running incrementality tests, you're either doing it with your own data in completely irregardless of what the vendor's reporting and tracking, or you're leveraging the vendor's first party, incrementality testing, like Facebook has conversion lift studies, the Trade Desk has split tests, right? So leveraging those two solutions kind of frees up the ability to get to market quickly with measurement, right? Because you do not need to tag everything, to track everything. The vendors already have everything set up to run their tests. If you run your own geo test, which we'll get into, you do not need to spend a lot of time setting up measurement anymore.
Okay.
If you have to track everything, it gets difficult.
Of course.
And that's why MTA is difficult. Okay, let's get into the next one, guys. So media mix modeling. So media mix modeling has been around for longer than most of us have been alive. It's a good complement to a brand's core incrementality and experimentation practice. In fact, everything we're talking about today does work together well. Each would work okay on their own to some degree. If you were to actually leverage all three, you'd get a lot of powerful information. So media mix modeling is one of those three. It does fit into the equation. It's good at creating high-level forecasting and budgeting scenarios, right? And so you generally have to look at a fairly large historical set of data. But if that data is stable, you can make some pretty accurate predictions on the near-term future, absent world-changing events like COVID-19 and things like that, right? So it does also capture the long-tail effect of media. And so channels that historically are really hard to track impressions and user level, linear TV, OTT, right? Those channels, you will almost see no value in last touch reporting because of the nature of the channel. But you will see value from media mix modeling because they have a long tail effect. And that effect is almost impossible to capture with user tracking, but modeling and tracking and tracking sales over longer periods of time is a way to understand the impact. It's a less restrictive model-based measurement than MTA. MTA is really only about media, digital media primarily, although it's mostly digital media. You need to track everything, right? That's what MTA is. Media mix modeling does not have that limitation. So it takes in offline media, online media. It can also build in other elements into the model, such as your promo periods, your high seasonal periods. It could also add offline promos, right? You're doing a big push in a market or something. Like that can go into your media mix modeling. It's quite flexible. And so that's really why it's probably never going away, because it is very flexible and it can be really tuned and built to to answer very, specific and unique business questions that other modeling and measurement struggles on. Like I said, the non-marketing variables are part of the equation. So what are the cons of media mix modeling? Well, as you're probably familiar, there's a limited granularity, right? So you're not going to have campaign level analysis because the campaigns are not big enough to be picked up in a media mix model. Some of your channels and tactics, especially new channels and new tactics, right, that you're just getting started in, those are not going to be picked up in media mix modeling. It's really kind of biased towards channels with a lot of impressions and a lot of ad spend that make the business move noticeably, right? And so the things that you're trying to do as a growth marketer is not, go take your non-brand search from 30% of your portfolio spend to 60. You want to find new channels to grow. And media mix modeling is a very difficult solution for understanding the value of anything new. And that makes it hard for growth marketers to use it. It's also difficult to interpret. The coefficients that it spits out, it's very much a data science product that marketers have tried to use. And so it's hard to explain the insights to the executive team. Just like it might be with any kind of data science output. It's expensive and slow. It's expensive not to actually, there's a lot of open source code that you can get for media mix modeling. It's expensive because the type of people that you have to hire to run it, they're not normally, it's very senior analysts or data scientists are needed. And it's slow because nothing is cookie cutter in the media mix modeling space. Everything really does have to be tuned to your specific business. And then the other con is it tends to draw curves on the past, right? So it's going to predict things based on what it's seen in your historical data set. If you are growing year over year by significant amounts, media mix modeling is going to be very inaccurate because it doesn't, your next 6 months are not going to reflect your previous 6 months.
Yeah, James, thanks for that. This is an interesting one because it wasn't one that I heard a lot about really until the last year, being in digital marketing for so long. And I hear about it almost daily from our members in terms of a measurement strategy that they're using. So what I'm hearing from you is that in order for a brand to use mixed media modeling effectively, they need to have, I'd say, consistent historical data. Can you elaborate on why and how far back do they have to have data from to make it work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So media mix modeling is predicting long-term trends on historical data, right? And so it is limited by its implicit bias in the historical data. Now, you might ask, say, what bias could there be in this historical data? Well, the bias in historical data is that your brand is different the next year than it was the year before, and your revenue is different, your media mix is different, and so it's not consistent year over year. Now, if Macy's deployed media mix modeling, that might work really well for them because their business may be pretty consistent year over year, relatively speaking. But direct to consumer and growth marketers who are seeing, 20, 30, 40, 50% growth year over year, those are their targets. Media mix modeling is not going to be very accurate because your historical priors do not reflect where your business is. In terms of how much historical data you need for media mix modeling, at least a year is generally the best practice, and up to 2-3 years would be better. And so that kind of speaks to why it has to be. It doesn't really fit young brands and brands that are growing pretty quickly and rapidly, right? The other reason, Sean, that you never heard this in digital, right? Media mix modeling was the solution for measuring offline channels, always. Right. So all marketers that were doing linear TV, not all, but a lot of them that were doing linear TV or a lot of out of home, which is less common than linear, right? But those brands were generally using media mix modeling because it was the only way they could understand the value. And so they just weren't applying it to digital because digital had these other more accurate solutions, user tracking, impression tracking, MTA, right? And so it wasn't really needed to understand the value of Facebook And whatever, what marketers were able to do with Facebook was much more accurate. When you were able to run, conversion lift studies in Facebook, you would get a result with a much greater fidelity than you would if you tried to put that into a media mix model. But nowadays, as you said, Sean, like the things that people used to do with digital in terms of measurement are no longer as effective and accurate. And so now they're going and saying, okay, well, what are the other things out there? Well, there is media mix modeling, and it's been used forever, and it's pretty well understood. And so it does technically work with all channels. It's just not the most accurate solution if there's other things available.
So when you're speaking about channels, it's interesting because I've heard a lot of brands say that they're in the face of sort of all this measurement challenges. I think they're just like, hey, if I can't measure it, I might as well try some other things, right? And so they're moving more aggressively into TikTok and audio and CTV, even in-game advertising, right? So it sounds like the answer is no here, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Can mixed media modeling provide directional support in making those types of decisions?
I personally think media mix modeling it's a very tall mountain to climb to ask it to have any value for new channels, right? Because the new channels don't exist in your historical data set. So you would need to be active on those channels for 6+ months before you can even start to put them into the media mix model. And then when they go into the media mix model, they have to drive a big impact, right? I mean, if you're on a new channel and you think it's adding 0.5% to your business, you are not going to pick that up in media mix modeling. It's just too broad a measurement approach. So I think it's very interesting, Sean, that you're saying, if I can't measure it, I might as well just go try new stuff that I always couldn't measure anyways. If nothing can be measured, then the things that I used to say were disqualified because I couldn't measure them, maybe I should look at them again. We're going to get into incrementality testing next, and there's incrementality testing really does cover 9 out of 10 channels. There's a really small number of things that you cannot do an in-market test on, and honestly, it's like podcasts and linear TV can get really expensive to test just because of it's targeting CPM increases that you encounter, but it's limited. And affiliate's the other thing that is very difficult to test. But other than that, most marketers should be looking first and foremost at in-market tests before they consider media mix modeling. Media mix modeling is a good solution to some problems. It is not the best available solution to measure campaign or channel effectiveness.
Okay, so you mentioned direct-to-consumer brands earlier and how it might not be the best for them given that their business is growing 30-40% every year, assuming they're somewhere between 2 and 5 years old. Is there a way for them to use mixed media modeling? If, let's say, they're a few years old, they have some historical marketing, but they are growing, right? And they are evolving because they're getting repeat customers now and maybe new products. And so they're still on that growth trajectory. Is there a place for it in those strategies?
Yeah, I think so. I think that you would want to understand its limitations when you use it, right? So you might not want to rely on it exclusively. And there are other options available. This is what we're saying is, it's not about selecting this, that, or the other measurement approach. It's about understanding for any given channel that you're trying to measure, what are the options available? What are the best options available? Both, time to information is very important, right? So some of these are going to take a while to spin up. Media mix modeling is one of them. You would not get media mix modeling results for the first few months at least, right? So in-market testing might be something that's quicker. But all of these things do fit together. And so I would just caution against using media mix modeling as your kind of measurement source of truth, because it's got a lot of limitations to it. And so it can be useful, but it also could be misleading.
Okay.
And so it is very important to have something else that you can leverage and kind of level set what you're seeing on your media mix model.
That's helpful. Before we get into incrementality, question from the audience is commercial mix modeling the same as mixed media modeling?
Commercial mix modeling. I don't know what that refers to be honest. You stumped me on that one.
We'll dig into that one later.
Okay.
Okay, let's move on.
I might know what it is. I might be thinking of it as a different term. But yeah, maybe as we go through this, Sean, if you want to Google it and see if something comes up.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, so let's talk incrementality. All right, so what is incrementality? Incrementality generally is your media's true contribution to your business outcomes, right? So most times it's sales and conversions. When we talk about incremental conversions, what we're talking about are conversions that would not have happened if not for the media, right? And so what we've seen historically is that, pre-2021, and actually like pre-April 2021, right? So pre-iOS 14, you can kind of universally say all of my digital media vendors are over-reporting. Meaning, if you were to compare their incremental conversions, which let's say you measured it with a test or you defined it with media mix model, but if you compare the incremental conversions to what the vendor reported, generally, it was over-reported, almost universally. It's very, very rare to find a vendor was under-reporting, right? Post-iOS 14, there's been a sea change. And what we're seeing is, and it's not just on Facebook, it's elsewhere too, but that a lot of vendors now underreport, meaning they are taking credit for less conversions than they actually incrementally drove, right? And so how could this actually be happening? The universe that the vendors are tracking is contracting. It's getting smaller and smaller every year. They can track less of the total, right? So they're still over-reporting on what they track. It's still happening. But now they're not tracking everything. Maybe they're only tracking 50% of the total. So they're like over-reporting on 50%, and then they're under-reporting on everything they don't track. And what you end up with is like this washout effect sometimes, or sometimes you end up with an incrementality, way above 100%, which means the vendor's under-reporting. Sometimes you end up with it way under 100%, which means the vendor is still over-reporting. It's gotten quite wild, and it changes quite often. It depends on your media mix, depends on your brand awareness, depends on your strategy for that channel. All of these things come into play. And so it's become even more important than ever to really run your own in-market tests so that you can understand for your business, for your channel, for that particular strategy, is the vendor over-reporting or under-reporting, and to what degree? Why is that important? Everyone uses vendors for their algorithms to optimize, right? You want to set a CPA target, you want to set a ROAS target, and you want to let Facebook go and do its job. The challenge is setting the right targets, right? You need to know how much they're over or under reporting so you can set the right target in Facebook and AdWords and Pinterest and Trade Desk, and you can push your revenue as far as it goes at that target. But first, you need to know what is the right target and what is the right value to pay for each conversion they report.
Okay. Next slide.
We put together this chart to demonstrate the difference between the incremental CPA and what we call the last touch CPA, but you guys can think of this as the Facebook reported CPA, right? So what happened when iOS 14 was rolled out is that Facebook lost track of a lot of users, and they also decided to change how they report conversions. They used to report conversions up to 30 days after the click and up to 30 days after the impression. Now, some marketers changed those look-back settings in platform, but that was Facebook's default. Mid-April 2021, they flipped the switch, and now all of a sudden they were only reporting conversions within 7 days of the click and only reporting conversions within 1 day of the impression. That was a fundamental, huge change in how Facebook reported performance. I'm sure most of you saw dramatic increases in your Facebook CPAs around this time. The marketers that were measuring Facebook's value with an in-market test, whether it was a geo test or something else, they knew that the value from Facebook was fairly consistent week to week, and what had changed was Facebook's reported conversions, right? So that blue line is the Facebook reported CPA. And that spiked when they changed how they report conversions, right? Because they basically removed a bunch of the attributed conversions from Ads Manager. The orange line is the incremental CPA that was measured with testing. And as you guys can see, that incremental CPA was pretty consistent, right? Now, if we extended this graph way past May 2021, up until last week, the incremental CPAs have now gone up as well. The CPMs on Facebook are much higher than they used to be. There's a lot of dynamics in this marketplace, right? But at this specific time, when Facebook changed how they reported conversions, marketers that were running in-market tests knew that they could continue funding Facebook and that there was still value there. And in fact, it became somewhat of an arbitrage opportunity because you saw a lot of marketers pulling back from Facebook because they weren't running testing. So they just saw their Facebook CPAs tank or dramatically increase. The ones that were running testing knew that wasn't the case. And many of them actually leaned into Facebook. Now, again, things have changed over the last 8-9 months, but that was definitely the case in April and May 2021.
Interesting. Okay.
Okay, so now let's talk incrementality testing, right? So high level, incrementality testing allows you to determine the causal contribution of media and to effectively define what % of the vendor reported conversions are actually incrementally attributed to the vendor, right? As opposed to incidental, meaning they would have happened anyways, even if the media was not involved. So what are some of the pros of incrementality testing, right? Well, it's good for short-term and mid-term campaign optimization. And so the tests typically don't have to run for more than, sometimes as short as 1 or 2 weeks, sometimes as long as 3 to 6 weeks, but normally they're pretty quick and the results come in pretty quickly. And they could be, pretty granular, which is why they're useful for that level of optimization. It's also really the only way to separate correlation from causation in a really rigorous way. And so media mix modeling attempts to separate these things as well, but it's less accurate and it's much more high level and broad. MTA doesn't really separate these at all, as it's not even part of its problem statement. But incrementality testing takes this head on. And it says incrementality testing's job is to separate correlation from causation and then give you the causation and let you act on that data. It's also privacy compliant. The experimentation is based and not assumption-led. It accommodates a number of different statistical models. It's not going to rely on user tracking, right? So it's very important. Lastly, it's going to use your source of truth transaction data for measurement. It's not going to be entirely reliant on vendor attribution modeling, which is really key, right? When the vendor's attribution modeling is so volatile, it's more important than ever to have another source of measurement that doesn't rely on what the vendors report in order to understand the value of the media. What are the cons of incrementality testing? Like I said, there's no perfect solution, so incrementality testing has its warts as well. The granularity is at the tactic of the campaign, so it's not at the user level. And that means it doesn't really facilitate the path to conversion analysis, right? So if you guys are familiar with Google Analytics or Adobe and you've used those path to conversion reports, you can't do that kind of analysis with incrementality testing because it's really about the contribution of the value of the thing you're testing. And you're not tracking the path to conversion, you're not tracking these touch points, so you don't know how the channels really interact. And that's what makes it difficult to test halo effects. It's not impossible. You can certainly design an in-market test that tries to answer the question of how does this channel impact this channel? But it's more difficult and you have to be more intentful with it. You have to actually go in with that as your main business question. It also requires historical context for designing experiments. So running incrementality testing on new channels that have absolutely no historical data, it's possible, but you're flying blind. You don't really know what to expect, right? And so it's better to launch a new channel, ramp up for at least a month, and then explore an in-market test so that you can at least see what the vendor's reporting as a baseline before you go into testing. And you'll make a better testing decision as a result. The last thing that makes it difficult, and this might start to sound like a broken record, because it's actually true of all three of these approaches, is that you need expertise to design experiments, just like you need expertise to deploy a media mix model, or you need expertise to build a multi-touch attribution model. Design of experiments is its own field, has its own nuances to consider. And so the risk of not doing it well is that you might not know you didn't do it well. And then you'll just see the result, and maybe that result is completely misleading, but you never know, right? Because no one's telling you that, hey, that design was invalid, and so you can't use this result. So it's the kind of space where you have to be careful, because you can there's a concept in analytics, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with, garbage in, garbage out, right? And so if you don't set up the design of the experiment correctly, you're going to have garbage data coming in, and then your insights that come out will not be very useful either. And the worst thing to do is actually make a decision on the wrong insight. It's probably worse than not making any decision at all. And so you really want to be careful on your design. Make sure that your changes are driven by data and driven by data with high fidelity.
Hey, James, when someone's looking at a report that's showing incrementality of all the channels in their media strategy, regardless of how many it is, obviously some are going to be more incremental than others. How can they use that data to understand how much they can push into that channel versus how much they should pull out of another channel? Does it guide them on like the optimization of the campaigns?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I like to tell marketers that incrementality is a percentage. Again, I'll define exactly what it means. We'll go back here, right? So incrementality is your incremental conversions that the vendor drove based on your testing or your media mix modeling or your MTA, right? Your incremental conversions in the numerator, and then it's divided by what the vendor reports in the denominator, right? So there's no such thing as a good ink or a bad ink, right? Because just like there's no such thing as a good conversion rate or a bad conversion rate, absent the cost of the media. You have to know what the cost of the media is to understand if that conversion rate is worthwhile or not, right? If the conversion rate is above 0%, then it's worth something, right? It's worth some amount of money. So the question is how much. So similarly with incrementality, if there's any incremental conversions from the media, it's worth something. So I wouldn't say there's a bad incrementality or a good incrementality. What the incrementality modeling and measurement does is it allows you to actually say, I'm looking at the CPA incremental. I'm looking at the incremental ROAS, right? And then that becomes your key metric that all the media is measured against. And then, yeah, absolutely, you would sort and effectively identify the channel that should be defunded and those that should be funded based on their incremental ROAS or their incremental CPA. So without the incrementality measurement, right, you would never know what is the incremental CPA or what is the incremental ROAS, right? So then you're just looking at all these different vendors who are over-reporting or under-reporting to some unknown degree, and they're all reporting something that's not accurate, and you're trying to compare across all these different measurement approaches, right? Incrementality testing brings it all into one formal approach of in-market testing, defining incrementality in the same way. Once you do that, the entire portfolio comes in the picture, right? Everything is now measured on one single KPI. And then it's a pretty easy exercise of, there's often some low-hanging fruit, some things that are clearly overfunded or clearly underfunded once you start doing in-market testing.
So, okay, that's helpful. So at least a couple of times you've mentioned sort of A/B testing or A/B vendor testing. How is that different in terms of execution and value than, say, incrementality testing?
It's a great question. So we would say, incrementality testing can include vendor lift studies, right? And Facebook is a good example. A lot of marketers have used the conversion lift studies that Facebook used to offer. I'm not sure if they offer them anymore. Anyone on this webinar, you should not be using conversion lift studies right now. They're not really accurate. Facebook's out there making that well known, but they used to be. And if you were to go to Trade Desk, they have their own, similar type of product that they can run for you. They're useful studies, and when we work with marketers, a lot of them are taking advantage of all the available measurement, and so that includes the vendor lift studies because they are useful. The major difference, this is getting a little in the weeds, but I'll try to keep it fairly high level. The major difference between a vendor lift study, like a Facebook conversion lift study, and your own geo-test is that when you run a Facebook conversion lift study, the universe is limited to what they track. That universe is limited on both sides, meaning the control group is only what they track, the treatment group is only what they track. The net is you will never measure more incremental conversions than the vendor reported in a vendor lift study, because they're limited to the universes the vendor track, right? And so it used to not be that big a deal, to be honest, because generally pre-iOS 14, all incrementality tests, whether it was something like a geo test or something like a vendor list study, generally, they're all going to show incrementality less than 100. They were all showing that the vendors were over-reporting. That's not the case anymore. This is why Facebook has tried to tell people don't use conversion list studies, because now they know that there's under-reporting somewhat frequently, and their conversion list study will not capture it. And so they're trying to encourage people to explore geo-testing and media mix modeling, because those things have the potential, at least, to capture the incremental activity that isn't being tracked and reported by Facebook.
So you mentioned Facebook several times. So I know I've heard from some of our members of a tool called Robin. I don't know anything about it, but I'm just curious if you know anything about it and where it fits into the conversation.
Yeah, so I believe that is Facebook released some open source geo testing code for, I think, for Python and for R. I believe that's what it's referring to. It might be referring to their open source media mix modeling. It's one of those two. In both cases, open source code is open source, which is great, but you can't just run it on Excel. And so, you need to be a programmer. You need to be familiar with these programs, specifically Python, probably, in order to run these things. And so it's not really something for marketers. It's for teams that have data scientists and don't want to build their own model. And why would you use Facebook and not Google? Google has something called the causal impact model that they released open source like 5 years ago. I don't know. I don't have a preference, honestly, between those two different approaches to the same challenge. I would say in both cases, if you have your own in-house data science team, those are good solutions to explore. It is difficult to scale those things across many different channels. Facebook is fairly specific to Facebook. Now, if you knew enough, you could take that open source and tune it and configure it so that it's available, that you could apply it to many different channels. But it's not going to be turnkey. It's not right off the bat for them. And same thing on Google. And so it's a useful thing to explore if you just want to, measure Facebook with a geo test and you have a data scientist, you have a marketing analyst who, built chops on Python before and can leverage those. So yeah, it's a good solution there. But I'm pretty advanced in analytics. I would not be comfortable running my own causal impact or my own, Facebook geotest with that Robin code they made open source. So it depends. I think it's unlikely that most marketers will be able to navigate those things on their own.
Thanks, James. This has been it's been a great discussion. I know we're way over time, but I want to take at least one question from the audience, and I think it's a good one, because we have, when I look at the attendees, we have people with different size companies, right? So typically different size budgets for testing and for measurement. So how much budget do you need in each of these strategies to be effective?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question to answer, right? There's not like a single number. I would say that you probably don't need to spend a lot on to use MTA. I'll give you guys an example. Google Analytics has something called data-driven attribution. It's a form of attribution modeling. So in Google Analytics, you can select last touch, you could select first touch, you could select data-driven attribution, right? And so you can leverage that with any level of spend on media. So that would kind of be the lowest hanging fruit, I think. That said, those solutions outside of what Google's offering, and that's only going to apply to what Google tracks, they're not cheap, right? So if you're not spending a lot to then go and put 20% of your ad budget into an MTA model that is only sampling 20% of the universe, it might not be very appealing. And so that's kind of, normally it's like these things cost money, and then it's relative to how much you would value it compared to your media spend. And so that normally is the constraint, more so than like, hey, you need to spend $1 million a month to use MTA. Media mix modeling, a lot of money, because again, you have to drive a big impact on your business, and those things normally cost a significant investment in order to pick it up with media mix modeling. I don't have a specific number there, but in market testing, I would say in general, you want to be spending at least a couple $1 million a year, if not more. And it could be less if it's really heavy in certain channels, and then maybe you can really just focus on those channels and measure them at a smaller investment. But if you're on 7-10 different channels, it's probably at least several $1 million a year in media spend in order to really get a lot of value out of in-market testing.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And I know we're way over time, and I want to thank everyone that stuck with us. Most people did to the very end, and we'll get this webinar posted on our events page at Cogent. If you have any questions or comments or needs, please reach out to your contact at Cogent, and we'll do our best to help you out. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.